Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another part of Mongers, and this time I'm here with Hochi, and we'll be discussing Germany, Germans, the German elections, and of course we'll also follow up on the Sudeten German Landsmannschaft Congress in Brno, because these are things that are simply connected. But the main news we have here is that the AfD is dominating the pre-election polls in Germany. As for the latest poll, as of May 21, 2026, the AfD received 27.2%, which gives it a 4% lead over the second government party, CDU-CSU, from which Chancellor Friedrich Merz comes. Behind them are the Greens with 13%, SPD, that is the Socialists, with 12.8%, also a government party. Then there's Die Linke, which are basically light communists, if I can put it that way. Well, hard to say, just leftists, okay? Leftists with 10%, then there's the FDP, a completely irrelevant right-wing party, and then there are the hardcore communists, BSV, 0.3%. Basically, you could say that. More like it's something like the German Stachilo, so these are more like fringe parties, but the important thing is that AfD has made it in, and is still holding on to the top positions. As for the elections, in the 2025 elections basically a year ago, they finished second. They had 20.8%, and CDU-CSU had 28.6%. At this moment, AfD has 152 seats in the Bundestag, while CDU-CSU has 208 seats. So you could say that it's slowly reversing because AfD is running at around 28%, while CDU is declining. So what do you think about it, guys? Come on, let's share our impressions about this growth, or rather this decline, and how do you interpret this whole situation? I'll tell you something about it, something of my own. And I'll definitely be glad if you ask about anything. Hopefully I'll be able to answer.
Sure. And you were referring to the last elections. When I looked at the electoral maps where AfD is winning, AfD primarily wins in the former German Democratic Republic. That's right. That means in the eastern part of the country, which according to statistics is still not only politically but also economically and financially worse off than the rest of Germany. And since, for at least the last 3 election terms, if I'm not mistaken, the coalition of CDU, CSU, and SPD has been in power.
No, you're mistaken, because last time it was SPD, the Greens, and FDP who were in power. Let's say a kind of green-red left-wing coalition.
Aha, okay, then that's my mistake.
But before that, for a long time, the CDU and CSU were in power. Merkel was from that party, actually.
Yes, that's mainly what I wanted to point out. That these governments didn't really take the situation in the east of the country into account, and there was no effort to improve it. So the local voters simply turned to another party. And this time, it simply wins, or a more radical one.
That means...
Logically, it makes sense to me, because if I want some change, something I don't like, something that's overall bad for me and my situation, and the parties I vote for don't want to make that change, or they don't even want to take action, then I'll go to another party that either directly supports my vision or a vision close to mine. And since there isn't any other strong party, so those voters automatically cling to the last option they have left. And that's alternative for Germany?
They think, wow, that could be an interesting alternative for Germany.
Yes.
Yes. So, and this actually brings us to the question of what the AfD really is. And I think we should introduce it, because it seems to me that people have all sorts of different opinions and feelings about the AfD, and they don't always match up with reality. At this point, I would probably go into the Sudeten German Congress, which is strongly supported by Bavaria. because the vast majority of Sudeten Germans, that is, former inhabitants of the border regions of the Czech Republic, mainly Bohemia and Moravia, ended up in Bavaria. And they ended up in Bavaria. As for Bavaria, the AfD has had some success there, but they haven't won there. At the moment, the CDU is in power there. Yeah. And at the same time, these Bavarians and their Landsmannschaft and the Sudeten Germans, they're not really present in Eastern Germany, where the AfD is actually growing. So here we have a bit of a strange situation because the AfD has a certain political opinion about the Beneš decrees and possibly their repeal, but at the same time, in the places where people mostly vote for the AfD or vote for the AfD in large numbers, there aren't any Sudeten Germans living there, so the Beneš decrees don't really have to concern them at all. In this regard, I'd like to set the record straight about something that's been spreading quite a lot here. And I also used to spread it in a simplified way. And that's the claim that the AfD has breaking the Beneš decrees in their program. The AfD does not have that in their program for Germany, for the entire Federal Republic of Germany. Okay? But as for the candidates in Bavaria, it was mentioned a few times there, mainly because these Bavarian AfD members wanted to siphon off the Sudeten voters from the CDU and CSU, those who voted for the CDU and CSU, and who had that resentment about the Sudeten issue. In other words, those who wanted to address the Sudeten issue in some way were not the nationwide AfD, and it's still not the nationwide AfD dealing with it. It was mainly the AfD politicians in Bavaria who brought it up. Yeah, that's something I'd like to set straight. What about you, man? Do you see it as more or less just populist talk in Bavaria? And maybe it would be good to stop using the argument against the AfD that they want to abolish the Beneš decrees? Or do you still consider it a serious issue or maybe hypocrisy on the part of the Czech SPD and ANO that they are making deals and getting cozy with these parties? Of course, ANO isn't getting cozy with the AfD, but they are getting close with Austria's FPO, who also have these close ties with the AfD and so on. So how do you see this? And
I see it as the Czech SPD standing on the same side as Austria's FPÖ and the AfD.
In Germany. Yeah, they have the same faction in Brussels.
That's right. They have very similar goals, but when it comes to the Beneš decrees, they're on completely opposite sides. FPÖ and AfD want to abolish them, while the Czech SPD wants to keep them. Even though, according to lawyers, those decrees are basically obsolete and actually have no effect on current law, they're de facto just a historical relic. Just a relic. From AfD and FPO's perspective, I understand why they want to abolish it from a historical perspective, even though it's already invalid.
They're targeting those voters, right? But they're targeting only the more radical Sudeten German voters, aiming to take them from the CDU.
And at the same time, SPD on our side is doing exactly the same thing, only they're targeting the other side of the voters, the ones who want to keep it as it is. Yeah, that means both parties are using the same topic, but each from a different side.
Which I find completely bizarre, that actually the biggest opponents of the Beneš decrees in Germany are the best friends of the biggest supporters of keeping the Beneš decrees in the Czech Republic. That's a totally contradictory situation. And that leads me to believe that this topic is simply about manipulating people and emotions, which is really totally off base, and it only confirms for me that just as the AfD in Germany are a bunch of crooks who stir up hatred against Czechs, the bunch of crooks from SPD in the Czech Republic stir up hatred against Germans. Both the AfD in Germany and the SPD in the Czech Republic have a big problem with the Sudeten German Landsmannschaft led by Posselt, who is actually from the CDU-CSU. And the Germans, the AfD is the AfD. They break up, destroy, and attack this group because supposedly they're not nationalist enough, in other words, not pro-national and not pushing enough for the interests of those Sudeten Germans. So they attack them for not being nationalist enough, and the SPD in the Czech Republic attacks them for being too nationalist, right? There's pressure and attacks from both sides here. So in a way, maybe there actually is some coordination between the AfD and the SPD after all. What do you think?
And I don't have any evidence for this claim, so I would rather classify it as more of a theory. Which does make sense, but we have nothing to back it up. At the same time, all three mentioned parties are very populist and very nationalist. That means they take this topic, which is already basically resolved, and they exploit it again. They simply reopen the grave and pull out the half-decayed body. Yes, because not only the governments of the Czech Republic, Austria, and the Federal Republic of Germany have agreed and both politically and legally closed this chapter, but even the Sudeten Germans as an entire organization have given up all claims to historical heritage and similar to property and historical heritage.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And with that, I would somehow close this AfD versus SPD issue and the Sudeten German matter. That's just a little detail. And at the beginning of the next topic and at the end of this one, I would like to emphasize and highlight once again that the German AfD, except for Bavaria and those regional places, does not have in its program any policy on the Sudeten Germans or the Beneš decrees. Yeah, that was a local matter. Of course, it can be confusing because Germany is a federation and each federal state has its own prime minister, its own elections, and its own local branches that have their own topics. And at that moment, when one part of the AfD deals with, for example, the Beneš decrees because they want to win over the Sudeten Germans in Bavaria, you might get the impression that this is the policy of the whole AfD. You could probably argue that if the AfD didn't agree with it, they wouldn't allow it as part of their program. Sure. But on the other hand, keep in mind that the AfD is a populist party, and this is simply just a way to gain voters. So even though I would love 100 times over to just throw it in the SPD's face that they're cozying up with the AfD, who want to abolish the Beneš decrees, in the end, it's necessary to say that yes, there is a certain ideological connection between a part of the AfD, the Bavarian AfD, and the Czech SPD, but there isn't a significant conflict between the Czech SPD and the entire German AfD. So I would just wrap it up like this, and it seems to me that this inconsistency is repeated over and over again by absolutely everyone who talks about this issue. Yeah, which I find really strange. People who talked about it just kept mentioning it. In the media, Petros talked about it in Kečia Politica. I said it. Radovan from Cynical News repeated it. Yeah, everyone was talking about it. Overall, you could say it's probably because we're copying from someone else, right? Maybe we're just copying each other. Hard to say. Anyway, yeah, it's just a bit different than how it's usually explained, typically. So yes. The fact that Okamura rejects objections from parts of the AfD over the Beneš decrees and the Sudeten Germans. Yeah, that's true. He rejects it. There were some objections, but again, it was only a part, right? And it was the part that had to stand by their campaign and the things they said. But it's just not politics. It's just not a priority. And it's not explicitly in the nationwide AfD program. Right. However, of course, it's a bit strange that SPD criticizes the Sudeten German Landsmannschaft, which doesn't have any revisionist talk at all and just wants to reconcile. And then they just happily shake hands and buddy up with the AfD, who from time to time, at certain levels, attack the Beneš decrees. Of course, this level of hypocrisy still applies. That's clear. Do you agree?
I agree.
Fair, fair. So if we go back to the AfD itself, let's take a look at a bit of German politics and German politicking. Because when it comes to the German political environment, the AfD doesn't really have any high positions anywhere yet. And as far as representation goes, there was only a sort of some kind of governor or something like that. Theoretically, there's talk that in the future there could be prime ministers of certain federal states like Saxony and Saxony-Anhalt. In Saxony and Thuringia, some prime ministers could win. That could happen. So far, the AfD in Germany is not directly in any higher position anywhere. There really is just some, well, it's not a governor, they don't call it a governor, but basically there's some lower level politician from the AfD there. He hasn't shown anything so far, right? He hasn't done anything bad or good, he's just average. While in office, they closed a school in that area, but he didn't accomplish much since he holds a low position. Overall, the AfD is currently dominating the polls, but there is something in Germany called a Cordon Sanitaire, or in German, Brandmauer, which means a wall, a firewall. And that's basically an agreement that if the AfD were to win the elections, everyone else would join forces, no matter how unlikely, just to keep the AfD out of power. What do you think about this practice of the firewall, that there is a certain agreement where, for example, conservatives from the CDU would join forces with the Greens and, I don't know, with the leftists just to prevent the AfD from coming to power?
No. And from their side, it makes sense because they see the AfD as a very radical political force.
They portray them as Nazis, right? Which isn't true, by the way, right? But there's a lot of talk about the AfD as neo-Nazi people. Which, like some in the AfD, yes, neo-Nazis would probably vote for the AfD, that's true. But the program, the politicians, and so on, it definitely doesn't match up. It's not exactly one-to-one.
No. Maybe what I would say is that it's very light.
Very light? Almost zero.
No, that's not correct about the program. It's really about the people. In that case, I'd say yes. He's asking about the connection between the devil and the demon. And from their side, I understand it, for example, from the CDU, CSU, that they simply want to prevent this very radical party from governing. But the consequence of that will be that people who didn't vote for AfD, or some of the people who didn't vote for AfD, will see that even though AfD won the election, everyone joined forces against them, and so they can't carry out their program. So some people will give them their vote in the next election because they won't be satisfied with that coalition against them, where the KDU is next to the Marxists.
I would probably say that it's downright anti-democratic, right? Because even though you make a coalition here of parties that have a democratic mandate, so theoretically you could say, yeah, CDU, the Greens, and SPD have a majority, so why shouldn't they form a coalition, logically? On the other hand, such a coalition is absolutely unable to agree on anything because it's just right-wingers and conservatives all the way to green leftists and red leftists. Such a coalition won't do anything for you. It'll just be that kind of stagnant governance, so no program, nothing. And next to that, there's the AfD, who might want to push some kind of program, and if they joined forces with the CDU, theoretically, I think they could agree on a lot of things and actually move Germany forward, but we don't talk to them. So there's one party that has and presents a program, even though it's populist, even though it's completely dumb, right? As is often the case with populists, but they have it and want to push it through. They can't, even though they won the election. And against them, a coalition has formed that doesn't have any program because there are too many of them and they're too fragmented. So that's something that Well, it definitely won't cause any excitement in Germany, right?
Maybe I would go back to politics for a moment because these aren't national elections in the sense of the whole federal republic. It's about the individual federal states.
So it still applies there as well.
Well, yes, that's true, but I would compare it to our regional elections very boldly because it's based on a similar principle. If you look at the makeup of the government or the Chamber of Deputies, those parties don't cooperate with each other. I'll say, for example, in some parts, ODS and ODS and ANO,
Hmm.
but at the regional level, they cooperate with each other because they know there's no point in dealing with national politics at the regional level, and that it's better to focus on the development of those regions rather than on independent politics. And I don't know how it is in Germany if that comparison fits 100%, but from this perspective, that's how I would see it. That even if the AfD wins there and the anti-coalition joins forces, they can still have some of the same interests. For example, improving industry so that it emits less harmful substances or improving education, so that they have better job opportunities. Yeah, for example, through renting company buildings, building new buildings for all the working people, and so on. So that's how I see it.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I have the AfD program, which I opened and basically had it processed and translated by artificial intelligence, and I had it summarize the most essential and most important points of the AfD, the ones that are in their program. I'm not going to pretend that I read it, that I know German, or that I analyzed it. So AI gave me a few main points of the AfD policy here. Point number one, I'll always read it first, and then we can talk about it in some way. Okay? All right. All right. Strict migration policy and remigration. AfD wants to consistently deport people without the right of residence, restrict stays, and return people whose reason for protection has ended. The main mobilizing topic, especially after the migration crisis and debates about security. So basically, for AfD, the main pillar of their programs is the deportation of migrants. This is problematic for many reasons, right? First of all, Germany needs migration because it needs workers. That's the first point. The second point is that it would have to be done in a pretty tough way, and I'm not entirely sure if people in Europe are ready for that. What do you think about their migration policy?
I think it's well set up because, as you already said, it doesn't reflect the economic demand. There is a demand for those working people, and the German population itself can't fulfill it. At the same time, the conditions are not explained there, or rather, it's not explained under what conditions the person will be designated for deportation. Yeah, a few details were cut out, like, for example, his protection ended or his work visa expired and so on. But a huge problem arises at the moment when you decide to deport the person, and that person is, for example, from Syria. First of all, the Syrian government can say, we won't take him, we won't accept him. And now what will happen to him? You don't want him in Germany, you want to deport him, but Syria doesn't want to take him back. So you just put that person somewhere in a camp.
Sure, sure. But those are just problems. Yeah. Those are just problems. And people often ask why the CDU just doesn't take this issue from AfD. Why don't they carry out deportations when they said they would? And here's exactly the problem. First, it's complicated because you can't just take a person and drop them off at the Czech border. Yeah, that's just not possible. So you can't just put them on a plane and simply take them away. They just won't let you do that. Yeah, and at the same time, you need that workforce. So it's not that simple. All right, next point. They want asylum powers returned to the national level. So they want again, or AfD wants to manage migration nationally again, and claims that the current European system has failed. Yeah. So in this regard, you could say that the migration agreement is not completely ideal. But another point is leaving the Eurozone and returning to the national currency. AfD claims that the euro is a flawed construct and that Germany should leave the euro system. In this regard, Germany was basically forced to adopt the euro so that they would be allowed to unify, right? Yeah, so Germany had to commit to adopting the euro, otherwise the French and the British wouldn't be okay with the unification of Germany. So you could say it's a kind of diktat. On the other hand, the European National or European Central Bank is based in Germany, I think in Frankfurt. Maybe it's somewhere else now, but in any case, according to the AfD, the euro system is a flawed construct. Yeah. No. I'm not completely sure about that, but the euro is currently the second largest currency in the world, right after the dollar. So it's hard to say what they base that flawed construct on. Maybe they don't like that great and amazing Germany has to pay for those terrible Italians and Greeks. That's what you think about it.
I would probably agree about the Italians, but I don't agree about the Greeks. The Czech economy has improved significantly.
I'll use it more as an example.
Yeah. Look, it's more like this.
Sure.
Chasing votes is just an attempt to appeal to the center. That historical sentiment. And when we were better because we had our own currency. So we don't want this new ugly euro here. We want our old German mark.
Yeah. So it's a kind of classic patriotism playing on those patriotic notes. And here using the realities of the end of the Cold War, manipulating things to make it seem as if something was forced upon Germany.
Well, it's a very strong nationalist populism.
So next point. Against a centralized European Union, the program talks about a Europe of homelands or a Europe of sovereign nations and rejects the centralizing tendencies of the European Union. That's close to the Czech SPD, but it's problematic for small states that depend on EU rules. To this, I would say that I fully understand that a German nationalist wants greater autonomy and independence for individual nations and wants to eliminate the democratic deficit within the European Union. I absolutely don't understand this when it comes to Czech nationalists, who supposedly want a unified, confident Germany that isn't restrained or kept in check by the European Union, the EU, in any way. I'm not sure if that model has proven itself in practice. What do you think about that?
I think that Czech nationalists didn't think that far into the future to foresee this problem.
Indeed.
Because by definition, they are populists who try to come up with the simplest solution. It's not about whether it's feasible or under what conditions, but about the fact that it's a solution and it's simple, so that the average voter can understand it.
All right, the fifth point, abolition of CO2 fees and opposition to the Green Deal. AfD wants to abolish CO2 levies and criticizes the fees. A kritizuje klimatickou politiku as ideological. Of course, this appeals to průmysl, drivers in the countryside, and anti-European voters naturally. In this regard, I would probably say that Germany is pursuing the Energiewende. People like Merkel, who shut down nuclear power plants, played right into this Green Deal nonsense. And I think I understand that. I get this point because it's actually good that the Germans made their own energy much more expensive. Then they also lost cheap supplies from Russia, which made their energy even more expensive. And overall, even though they're now building those renewable sources and improving the situation, they didn't count on losing Russia. And that just created the biggest problem, which really messed up their plans, right? So in this regard, I guess I understand their problem. On the other hand, I would say that maybe the Germans could be more ambitious about where they're going to get their energy from to start those Yaderke, okay. But at the same time, they could be more ambitious about being the ones who develop those green, in other words, efficient technologies, which they will then sell to the world. China has already taken solar panels from us, so let's, as Europe, come up with some other things that we can sell to the world, just like China sells solar panels. Well, anyway, the CO2 tax. What can I say about that?
I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. According to these people, emission permits are wrong, the CO2 tax is wrong, and any effort is wrong. Any attempt at sustainability is, according to them, very wrong, as is any attempt at recycling materials or reusing any technologies.
They have a locust mentality, consume everything, then move on. But we don't have a second planet.
Yes, to put it simply, you mentioned solar panels earlier. Solar panels are partially recyclable. A few years ago, I read an article that discussed this, saying that roughly 40% of the entire panel can be recycled. And recently, I read that this percentage increases every year as technology improves, right? But according to these people, you would just take it, throw it away, and install a completely new one without caring about what happened to the rest.
All right, next point. Return to nuclear, coal, and cheap energy. We know that from the Czech Republic as well. Beer will be cheaper and football every day. That's just nonsense, right? But they want to restore nuclear energy, extend coal, and repair Nord Stream. Well, that brings us, of course, to the next point, which is probably the worst of all for me. Normalization of relations with the European Union and Ukraine outside NATO and the European Union. Subtitles. So, what do you think? What do you have to say about this? It almost seems to me that everything else is just a distraction around this absolutely disgusting collaboration with the Russians. Opinion?
My opinion is based on several investigations conducted by the local police, which concluded that some AfD politicians, or some, I don't know if regional or national branches, are being paid with money from Russian oligarchs. Or directly in some way connected to Russian state-owned companies, which supports or actually reinforces the idea that they are trying to push ideas and situations that will be more favorable to Russia. For example, again, repairing Nord Stream or building Nord Stream 2, or political pressure to prevent Ukraine from joining the European EU or NATO one day, and so on and so on and so on, etc. A tak dále.
Yeah, Nord Stream, a huge dirty trick against Eastern Europe. Like, it doesn't matter what those lousy Czechs and Poles thought, we'll just bypass them nicely. Exactly, that's Nord Stream. And it was always Nord Stream. Unfortunately, or thank God, now it depends on what we think, at least for now, until Nord Stream is restored. So the ninth point, tax cuts and tax simplification. AfD wants a simpler tax system, lower rates, and the abolition of wealth and inheritance taxes. Wow, this seems really stupid to me, because instead of lowering taxes on labor and consumption, they're lowering taxes on property, which will motivate people to pour money into real estate, which is just terrible, right? That's my view on this matter.
So I agree there are much better options for which taxes to adjust and how to set up the tax mix so you can please your voters, but at the same time not lose the potential of the money that the state actually collects from those taxes. So that it doesn't suddenly happen that instead of the 400 billion euros the state is supposed to collect, you only collect 180 from taxes, and then you have nothing left to fund the state, so the economy starts to change. And it starts to lose momentum. So it's another populist move.
And at the same time, of course, they don't forget to add that they're not just right-wing liberals because they want to lower taxes, but they're also very worker-friendly, pro-ordinary people and socially minded because they want to help families and so on, right? So it's the classic Anno style, lower taxes, increase benefits, and the budget. Well, that's something the next generation will have to deal with. That might be manageable for us, but Germany's debt is much higher, so they can't afford to do that now.
Is that right?
That's right.
Like, everyone would like low taxes, pretty girls, and lots of beer. But someone has to pay for it.
That's right. And then there's this little problem. I'll just toot my own horn here. It's hard to say if it's liberal, left wing, or what it actually is. Personally, I'm in favor of taxing property and easing consumption and labor taxes. It's like tax those palaces, tax those apartments, tax those cars, tax everything that's not labor or consumption. Well, maybe not cars, right? Since in a way that's consumption. But simply lower taxes on consumer goods and increase taxes on housing and all these property related matters. Increase taxation on, I don't know, investments, gold, all these so-called capitalist nonsense things. Well, but that's just something that came to my mind when I was looking at what the American economy was built on in the 1950s and 60s. And no, it wasn't high taxation of labor and low taxation of property. It wasn't. That's it. Anyway, do you want to add anything to that?
No, nothing else about taxes.
Not about taxes anymore. You've paid your taxes. Excellent. And the 10th point is, of course, a culturally conservative state, meaning the rejection of gendered language, emphasizing German culture, national identity, and the traditional concept of German society. Which is, of course, largely taken from the United States, but also, for example, the culture war borrowed from Poland and Hungary. What can be said about this? Look, it depends, yeah. It depends on what is meant by that. Rejecting gendered language in politics. It's kind of a rejection of gendered language.
Honestly, I don't really know about that.
What is meant by that, you know? Whether they'll ban transitions or what exactly does that mean? No, forgive me.
I wanted to use one of those pauses to emphasize and quote Mr. Tittlebach and the title of one of his publications, which says, "We have always been here." That means that AfD simply has no way to change the fact that these people will be here. Those people in the population have always been represented, are represented, and will be represented. It's simply a populist outcry.
It's that kind of targeting those people who, for some reason, are pissed off and think, hey, maybe those young people at that pride parade are to blame for my bad life. Maybe it's their fault. But like language and gender issues, on one hand, they say that people should be educated about these things and that children should be educated about them. But at the same time, they say that gender politics shouldn't be pushed in schools. Yeah, and for a moment, like, does that cancel each other out? It doesn't cancel out. It actually cancels out quite a lot. Yeah, because when you think it doesn't cancel out, because after all, educating children, they consider that education to be gender politics, right?
Oh, that's what you mean. I see. Yeah, then that's fine. I understood it a bit differently, that gender politics shouldn't be taught in schools.
Yeah, and I'm actually taking this from Czech conservatives who are dealing with this, and I assume that the German ones are exactly the same because today we're all exactly the same, right? When it comes to promoting certain opinions and attitudes, especially in Europe, it's always just the same thing, and actually the arguments are always very similar. In the end, by the way, there are 88 viewers here, but that doesn't matter. In the end, the argument is always very similar in that, oh my God, I really don't know how to explain the issue of transition and transsexuals to my children. What am I supposed to tell them? It's awful this is happening on the street. And they say, well, maybe people should educate themselves about it, but it shouldn't be pushed, right? And it seems really schizophrenic to me.
So a simple solution is to start an after-school club.
Maybe.
I sent that topic away.
But maybe, of course, they're talking about things like not using genders or, not calling us he if they don't want that and so on. But that's kind of like forcing people to be something they're not. Hard to say. Like, hard to say if it's not just meddling in people's bedrooms and genders unnecessarily.
Yes, these are similar arguments to the ones we had here at the beginning of the millennium or the early 2000s, see? That if a child is raised by a couple, two gays, then the child will become gay. It's
a similar kind of thinking. Well, because if a child is raised by a couple, two heterosexuals, then they always grow up to be heterosexual, right? And gays apparently just appear out of nowhere, obviously. Because, yeah, like, if a child is raised by two homosexuals, how does that make them homosexual? That homosexual probably came from a straight couple. That's why I say,
that it seems to me like very similar arguments.
well, it's stupid, honestly.
Now it's not about gays, it's something else.
This is just the stupid part. Otherwise, it's about emphasizing German culture, national identity, and traditional societal concepts like the family. Hey, why not? They need to raise the birth rate. Like everyone in Europe, we all need to have more sex. And emphasizing German culture, national identity, I'm a bit afraid that in the end, it won't really be about emphasizing national identity and national culture, but rather lying to themselves about history and lying to themselves about culture, kind of like how our patriots here always brutally lie to themselves, right? The thing is, if you want your nation to be proud of its history, then you can't present that history in a complex and truthful way. Because most nations don't have a history they can be proud of. What do you think about that?
No, every nation has a huge black stain.
Yes. Yeah, and at that moment, you can't really be proud of your history as a whole when you present it objectively and without time skips.
Well, we're back to the fact that it's populism.
Yes, of course. But you always just shorten it so nicely, spit it out, and throw it away. Whatever. Look. Circle, let's give the final verdict. AfD currently has a dominant position in German politics, but it has zero coalition potential because there's that firewall. At the same time, the AfD's program is classically populist and nationalist. There's probably nothing surprising about that. There are a lot of promises there that probably won't turn out well if they come to power, or they'll only be half fulfilled because most of them are just castles in the air. People will naturally rebel against it, and it will just create problems. As for the Beneš decrees, even AfD doesn't have anything risky there, of course. Simply put, for us Czechs, AfD isn't a risk if we look at it this way. The only risk here is Okamura's hypocrisy, who attacks perfectly decent people while at the same time cozying up to people who at least occasionally mention revenge for the decrees, which is just bullshit. But in any case, AfD is leading, and it will be very interesting to watch the regional elections, not just the nationwide German ones, because if AfD is going to have success anywhere, it will be in those elections in the individual federal states. Well, so far it hasn't happened anywhere, but as their support grows, I assume that sooner or later AfD will manage to succeed somewhere. What do you say? Thank you.
If they don't succeed now, they'll succeed in the next elections when people will reflect on the fact that everyone united against AfD.
Unless those who unite do something about energy prices, migration, security, and take the wind out of AfD's sails. In any case, these are warmongers who keep going. And of course, you can watch the full stream recording on Hero or through membership on this YouTube channel. So I'll be really glad if you join there. And yeah, we're moving on to the next topic, so keep watching. All right?